So, hello everyone. My name is Alex. I'm a principal engineer here at Atlassian. I work on the design system team with Andrew, who just spoke as well. But I've been working in the drag and drop space for a while. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is how we can take the drag and drop that exists in the browser today and safely evolve it to make it easier for engineers to work with and make it also easier to create delightful experiences for users. So before I go into unpacking that, firstly, let's just set some context. Well, firstly, what is drag and drop? I mean, in its most general sense, it's any interaction where you're depressing a pointer device, moving that pointer device around, and then releasing it. More specifically for web platform drag and drop, we have sort of different categories of things. So you have some elements in the browser that have drag and drop capabilities built in. You don't have to do anything. So that's things like if you have an image in the browser and you drag it around, or links, you can drag a hyperlink up to the top of your screen and create a new tab, for example. You can drag text around, and you can also drag files into the browser, which is super useful, right? You can opt out of those behaviors, but they're built in. Over here, then, we have elements. So this is any element that exists in the browser. You can specify to the browser, hey, I want this thing to be draggable. And usually when we think of drag and drop, we're thinking of this thing over here. This is how we build sortable lists, boards, reorderable grids, resizing, all that kind of stuff kind of lives in that elements category. The drag and drop that the web platform ships is optional. You don't have to use it. In fact, I'm the author of React Beautiful D&D, which is a drag and drop library that doesn't use the web browser's built-in drag and drop capabilities. It instead rebuilds those from scratch. And there's a category of libraries that do that. The reason they do that is because of some shortcomings that I'll talk about in the web platform, but it lets you have complete control over how that interaction happens. Now, with that control also comes a lot of drawbacks as well, but I'll get into that later. All right, and then we've got other libraries, like commonly, say, React D&D, if you've used that one. A newer one that I've been working on is called Pragmatic Drag and Drop. That's technically not public yet. It kind of is, kind of isn't. We're going to be releasing it publicly in a few months. Tonight, I'm not actually going to be talking about Pragmatic Drag and Drop, the library. I've talked about it at React Sydney, and I'll send some links out on Twitter after this if you're interested in what that is and how it works and how it's different from all these other things. But tonight, I'm focusing on kind of the web platform itself. But it's just for our purposes tonight, it's good to know that some libraries are reimagining drag and drop, building it up from pointer events and doing all the hitbox detection themselves, and some are using the web browser's built-in capabilities. So we're commonly told, like, use the platform, right? And there's good reason why we want to do this. And those reasons are also true for drag and drop. So you get so much for free if you can use the web platform. So you get hitbox testing, so what the user is currently kind of over and where it's going into. A big one is making features work well together. Like, it was one of the hardest problems on React Beautiful D&D was to get dragging working with all the other rich interactions that are possible on the web and not stamping on the foot of those other interactions. If you use the platform, browsers themselves deal with that. You don't have to write any code, you just get that for free. When using the web platform, you get drag previews. So what that is when you're dragging something around, you're usually dragging, a representation of that item. The platform will give that to you for free. Conceptually, you also get cross-browser support. So the big idea of use the platform is performance, shipping less code. We don't have to teach the browser how to do drag and drop. We can just tell it what we want to do in our apps, right? Sounds good in theory. However, being successful with web platform drag and drop is really hard, like way too hard. I don't think it's within reach of most teams to actually use successfully, which is why these libraries exist, right? Because it is really, really hard to work with. The APIs are pretty challenging. Common use cases are really, really difficult to achieve. Personally, for pragmatic drag and drop, I've had to create novel techniques that didn't exist or I haven't seen them before to actually get stuff working in a way that you would think it would be able to work. There is a huge amount of browser bugs, which again, pragmatic kind of glosses over. It doesn't have all the control you would want. Some things are there's a lack of control over some things, which is kind of frustrating. Anyway, so that's the web platform. It's actually really hard. So what do we do about that? Well, we can change that, right? And that's the idea of this talk. It's not to propose to you a new drag and drop API for the web. It's to take the APIs we already have and see how we could safely evolve them to make them easier to work with. Now, I'm going to be throwing a number of proposals out there, and my intention is that none of these proposals are kind of done. I do plan on writing a blog, I've started writing it, which is going to go into a lot more detail, and I'm also planning on creating formal proposals to the relevant web standard bodies. And even what I have today, I know will change. Like, I've created a lot of APIs, a lot of public APIs, and the best ones, you really want to spend a lot of time thinking about it, especially for the web platform, because you kind of get one shot at some of these things. So you want to make sure that these APIs are really solid. So all this is to say that don't get too bogged down in the specifics. They'll most likely change, but the ideas, I think, are pretty sweet. Okay, I'm not going to talk about accessibility tonight, but it is a very important and related problem to drag and drop. When we release pragmatic drag and drop, or if you watch that other talk, I've talked about accessibility, and we have a lot of other things to help with that problem space. But I just wanted to put this slide in there to say, like, this is an important concern, but it's just not in the scope of what I'm talking about tonight. Yeah, as I mentioned, there's the talk, so I'll link it afterwards. Okay, cool. So let's get some terminology and important pieces what we're out of the way. Okay, so, here we go. Is this working? Oh, okay, this is really whack for me. Okay, there we go. So this element here is our draggable element. That's the thing where we're going to say, hey, we want to be able to drag it. This is a board. You'll see this in lots of different things like Trello. And this might represent a task or something like that. Now, usually with that draggable, we'll have some initial data that we're associating with that entity. So if it's a work thing, it might be like a task ID, its current status, like is it, to do. There might be a few different pieces of information, who the owner of it is, a few different things. We'll also, I didn't mention it there, but we might have a drag handle. So that's the idea that we might want this whole thing to be draggable, but you only want to be able to drag it from just one part of that. That's pretty common. And then when you start dragging, you generate this thing here called a drag preview. So there's a few different names for that. Ghost images, but I'll stick with drag preview, drag images, drag previews. Drag preview, that's a thing that you drag around to represent the entity that's being dragged. In this case, it matches what the draggable is. Now on the web platform, this draggable element stays in place. It doesn't get removed, right? This is just a photo. I'll go into this a bit more later too. This is just a photo of that element. So this element here doesn't change. So what I've done here is I've just dimmed this element to give some clue that that's the thing that's being dragged, but you could delete it, you could hide it, you can kind of do whatever you want. Then we also have drop indication. So this is also really important. I don't know if you've been on websites, I know I have, where you're dragging something around and you don't really know what's going to happen. Commonly with like files, you drag it and you're like, I hope this is going to be an upload, but I don't know what's going to happen. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Drop indication is really important. So this is giving a user a clue or a signal that what's going to happen when they actually release the thing that they're dragging. So in this case here, I've got this column here highlighted blue. I've also got a line indicating where the item's going to drop. Now, this drop indication, there'll usually be associated with that some data representing what's happening during the drag. So in this case, we might have some data that says, okay, the user's currently dragging over the second column, and also they're dragging over this second card here. They're closest to the top edge of that card. And so we're going to draw a line there, right? So we've got some data associated with the drag that is changing during the drag. So as the user moves it around, that data may change. Okay, cool. So we'll get into drag previews. So this is probably one of the best, if not the best feature of the web platform's built-in capabilities. And I mentioned this before, but what happens is that the browser by default will take a photo of that element and use that photo as the thing that you're dragging around, not the element itself. It sounds whatever, but it's actually amazing. So here's an example I've got where I'm not using the native drag preview. What I'm doing instead is listening for drag events and shifting the item around using CSS transforms. Okay? So every time the user's moving, I'm moving the thing around with CSS transforms. Now, what I've done as well is I've also put a loop on the page that is really hurting the CPU and causing the frame rate to drop to about 10 frames per second. And you can see that that drag preview, its movement is very stuttered. Okay? And that's because those CSS transforms are also locked into the frame rate of the page. So if your page struggles, your drag preview movement is going to struggle. Now, you might not be running at 10 frames all the time, but you might, during an interaction, you might do some expensive calculation or some data comes in from the back end, and you might drop a few frames. And you can, I'm guessing a lot of you have kind of felt that as you're dragging something, you kind of feel a bit of a snitch or a hatch. That's because it's locked to the browser's render loop. Okay. Here is the same page using the native drag preview. You'll see that the native drag preview is running at a beautiful 60 frames per second, regardless of what the page is doing. And that's because it's rendered on a completely separate layer by the native OS. This is, I think, one of the coolest things. It makes interactions feel buttery smooth, even if your page is kind of struggling. Another really cool feature about this is the ability that you can drag. This preview is not tied to your document. You can drag it between websites. So now you can have like Trello on one side, Jira on the other, and you can drag stuff between it. That's totally fine. Whereas if you're not using the native drag preview, everything's locked inside that window. You can't drag out of it. This is probably the best feature of the web platform one. Unfortunately, default drag previews are pretty cooked. So by default, if you don't do anything, it will just take a photo of the element. Sounds good? That's fine. In practice, it turns out that this is, yeah, it's cooked. So this is in Chrome. If you've got a scroll bar over your preview, you can see it's capturing that scroll bar. I think all these are from Chrome, but they all kind of have their own jank. This is, you can see that it was cut off the overflow on the bottom of that scrollable list. That's cut the drag preview in half, which is so great. And in a related bug at the top, you can see it's capturing that Jira thing in there. Rounded corners, this is all the default paper. The rounded corners don't work. It's capturing the background color behind that. That looks terrible. If you have CSS transforms on your drag preview element, like your draggable element, Firefox kind of handles that okay. That's probably what you'd expect. When you drag, so I've rotated the item and now I'm dragging it and the drag preview looks like it started. Chrome kind of is okay. I mean, it's not the worst thing. It just reverted it. But Safari is just like completely balked. And that's just rotation. Like there are lots of other weirdness with scale and like it just does not, the default algorithm is not great in any of the browsers really. This is an okay fix before I go on, just for the clipping one. What you do is in on drag start, you just quickly scroll it into view before it takes the photo. And that fixes that kind of clipping issue, but still not ideal. Okay. Now, a really common thing you want to do with a drag preview is you don't want it just to be what it was. You kind of want to change its appearance in some way. So for example, here I'm just changing its background color to be green. Now, this is really, really hard to do, and I had to create a technique last year to actually do this. Like you'd think you'd be able to do this. It's not easy. So here we go. And you need to understand a lot about how the browser works and how the timings of different things work. So firstly, we have our element up here, beautiful resting element. We then get the drag start event. Now, how the browser works is it will synchronously capture the image of the element after the drag start event has occurred. So what we do is, on drag start, we change that element. So here I'm changing it to be like a lighter blue, and I'm changing the text. So at the end of drag start, the browser takes a photo of that element. Now, in this on drag start event, I'm scheduling an animation frame to revert that change. So it goes back to where it was. Why am I doing this? The user never will see this, okay? So how request animation frame works is it will run just before the next paint of the screen. So this was never painted to the screen. This was sort of calculated by the browser, and it takes a photo of it. And then we revert it quickly before the user sees it. So what this means is we can change the appearance of the drag preview without it flashing awkwardly on the screen. Pretty sweet. Yeah. So change, capture, revert. Now, you don't technically have to revert. So in this one here, instead of reverting, I've made it grade, whatever. It doesn't have to. You don't have to revert. You could change its appearance to how you want it to be for during the drag. Now, this approach is pretty limited. You can do minor things like change the background color, change the border color, but you can't change its dimensions. There are some changes, which I won't go into, which can cause the drag to be completely cancelled. So this is useful, but only for simple changes. So we need to go a bit further. Thankfully, the web platform has an API. This is in onDragStart. You can call setDragImage, and you can pass in another element that you want to be the drag preview. Sounds useful, right? So here I've got another element on the page called preview element, and I'm going to say, hey, use that as the preview. Cool. And then so that's what's happening. Like I've got that little preview element there. Unfortunately, that image needs to be in the DOM and visible at the end of drag start for it to be captured. That is really like what you're not doing when you've got a draggable is pointing to some existing element on the page. Like when I'm dragging my little card around, there's not some other card on the page that looks like the drag preview of that thing. What I really want to do is create a new element with whatever information I want to be in that drag preview and say, take a photo of that. So using the technique we saw before, created another technique for doing this, same kind of idea. So here's my little card. So what I'm going to do in drag start is I'm going to effectively, this is called portaling, but I'm creating a new element, appending it to the body, so it's not impacted by its parents' styles, placing it on the topmost Z index that the browser allows in the top corner of the viewport. So now that I've got my wonderful little canvas up there, I can put my new drag preview element in there, say to the browser, use this element, please. The browser takes a photo of it, and then we delete everything in the next animation frame. And so that element is never painted to the user's screen, but we can then do anything we want as the drag preview, which is pretty great. This is it kind of in the wild, I guess. This is our Jira backlog here. You can see that this is a drag preview that's been generated, and it's like a stripped down version of that. But it's a completely separate element that was created dynamically in response to the drag. Before I go on, just to sort of hopefully just share some of the pain that we have to go through working on the web platform. Pragmatic drag and drop covers over this stuff for you if you use that. But in this example here, this is in Safari. This drag preview has had the opacity manually lowered. So drag previews already have a little bit of opacity on it by the web browser, but this one has lowered that even further. And what is happening is that because it's transparent, stuff behind it is being captured by Safari. This might make it a little bit clearer. That's where it will be rendered, like on the viewport, and you can see that there's kind of stuff behind it has been picked up. So what do? This is just for Safari, fun. There is an Open Safari bug for this that we raised, but we push that container essentially off the screen, almost. If it's off the screen completely, Safari says like, no, you can't do this. So we just put it on the screen, and that works. It doesn't, because it's kind of like there's nothing behind it, because it's basically off screen, and then you kind of get around that problem. So this is it fixed in Safari. Cool. This is all just like stuff that people have to wrestle with. Okay, so you're thinking portals. You might be thinking, hey, there's this new thing called the Popover API, which is kind of like got this whole layer thing happening. So just a crash course in that. Basically, you can use this API to create an element that sits on top of everything else. has a very, very recently now supported in all the major browsers. And so you can see there this top layer thing in the browser. That's what I was doing with my container element, sort of. This is like more endorsed, or sorry, a more platformy way of doing it. So yes, we can use this same technique with popover elements. So instead of creating a container, we can do the exact same thing, but use a popover so we don't have to worry about the layering stuff if we don't want to. So here is it kind of working. That's using the popover API to generate drag previews, which is pretty awesome. This is technically, if you kind of want to see how it's working, I've janked it a little bit, but you can see I don't actually hide the drag preview element. I'm just kind of leaving it there. I don't revert it. But yeah, that's sitting on the topmost layer. I usually put it up in the top left, but I've left it there for illustrative purposes. Anyway, yes, this is sort of it coming together. So what could we do? This is the first proposal. Could we create some way of providing an element to this set drag image and say, like, please, like, just do the portaling for us, right? Do the whole, like, mounting it, unmounting it stuff. This one probably needs more work than most, but yeah, the idea is you create an element, set some attribute on it, populate it, give it its class name, whatever you want to do, and then pass it in here. And because it's got that specific attribute, the browser does something specific with it. This would be great, because then we wouldn't have to worry about all the layering stuff. It could just do it for us. For completeness, this is essentially stealing the popover API, the declarative one. I don't think this would be super useful because usually you're dynamically creating drag previews, but I think for completeness and parity, it could be nice to have one that matches the popover API. Positioning drag previews relative to the user's cursor. So it's like, where do you want the user's cursor to be on this drag preview? So that's what the X, Y values are for. So it starts in 0, 0 in the top left corner, and X, Y, you can kind of push the user's cursor over that preview element. Now, it is really difficult to actually get it, well, not really difficult, but too difficult, too much hoops to get some common stuff working. So if you think about 0, 0, this is, there is a typo in this code, the double R, but this is the idea that in order to actually get the cursor under the center, you have to measure that element using getBound client rect and then like put it in the right spot and pass that in. Like, it shouldn't have to be this hard. This one I'm not going to go into, but this is if you wanted to match where the user's cursor is on the original element on the new one, you have to kind of do this interesting comparison match between the two bounding boxes. It's not straightforward, okay? It shouldn't have to be that hard to do it. Also, if you want to push the drag preview away from the element, that's technically not supported, which is really whack because it's sort of in UIs everywhere. And I could not figure out how to do this. Margin doesn't work, padding doesn't work. Basically anything you could think that would work doesn't. And then I saw it working in Spotify and I looked at how they were doing it and I've stolen their technique. Thank you very much, Spotify. And that is you use a transparent border. You put a transparent border around it and then the browser, like, that all works. If you use anything else, the browser tries to be clever and remove it, which is really frustrating. I think they're good intention, but yeah. So this is a way you can push the drag preview away. If you open up Spotify now and you drag around a playlist, you'll see that it's pushed off to the side. And in that Jira example before, you'll see that. We use this pattern a lot. But yeah, pretty whack that you've got to kind of go through all these hoops to do a pretty common case on the web. So here's my proposal. Give it the ability to specify an origin point. I use block and inline because I'm trying to be fancy here, but effectively I want to be on like block start, inline start, like that's where I want the cursor to start, or center, or a pointer. Like this is where a special case to say like, hey, this is where the user's pointer is right now. And that's your origin point, and then you can specify an offset. So say like, hey, I want it to be in the center, but minus 10 pixels, for example. So instead of having to calculate all these points, like, can't we just pass these in? Like, that would be really great. So what would that look like? Yeah, this is some TypeScript stuff, but effectively it kind of just boils down to something like this. So you'd say like, yeah, top right is block start, inline end. Awesome. That would be really nice instead of having to use getBound and client rect. This is a safe change too, because the second argument of get drag image is X and Y numbers. It'd be very, very easy for them to detect whether it's an object and then treat this differently as opposed to a number. And then that's with the offset thing. So this would be 10 pixels above the top center of the element. Awesome. This would be really great and would be pretty safe to do it as well. Unfortunately, the browser has some all browsers have baked in opinions about what drag preview should look like. Thankfully, they're not too bad, too egregious, but they do lower the opacity to 0.9 and they add a specific box shadow on it. I can see why they've done this for consistency. However, it is really painful when you want that control and it's locked away from you. I've seen very serious conversations about people not using web platform at all because they just do not want these design decisions. Like, please trust us that we're going to do the right thing. Like, we could have just used another library to do this anyway, so please just let us do it. I think maybe we could just add a pseudo selector to an element that's being used as a drag preview, and any styles on there would override the default ones. So we could explicitly say, like, hey, I actually want opacity 1 and no drag preview, or I want a no box shadow, or I want like a custom shadow. This would be great. This one is just Windows 11 making a weird design decision. So on Windows 11, if you have a drag preview that is greater than 280 pixels in width or height, it lowers the opacity from like 0.9 to like 0.2. It's basically unreadable, the preview anymore. I can see why people would have done this, right? It's like, hey, big previews, like they'll block the screen. This is kind of not great. But this turns out to be like a huge problem. Firstly, I had to discover this manually through lots of testing. But this just sucks when you're doing stuff that actually you do need large previews for. Like, let's say you've got a column in an Excel document and you're moving it around, like to have it just opacity just get tanked because it's a certain size is pretty annoying in my opinion. And I think even if Microsoft wants to have that as the default, like could we please have, like using that, say, pseudo selector we had before, the ability to override that, right? Even if they think that's the same default, like please let us override the defaults when it makes sense. This is a really big limitation for us at Atlassian because obviously we have customers, lots of different hardware. So we right now advise people not to use drag previews greater than 280 pixels because of this. Like it's such a painful design constraint. Thankfully, it's actually kind of, in some ways, there's some niceness to having that constraint, but I won't go into that here. All this is to say, please let us have control there. Images and drag preview. So in this drag preview here, I've got an image, my lovely face, and yeah, this is really common. You'll have like an icon or a user's picture or something like that. Now, getting images to work with drag previews is really, there's a lot of foot guns here. So the key is that the image has to be ready for rendering at the end of drag start. If it's not ready for rendering, the browser just doesn't render it. If it's not ready, it doesn't get rendered. So when is an image ready? Or what things are safe? So inline SVGs, great. Browser's fine with this. You want to draw an SVG, awesome. That'll work. Inline base64 images, okay, cool. This is going to work, right? Unfortunately, no. So what happens in browsers is that image rendering in the DOM is not necessarily you just putting in an image tag and it's just there. It's got a few steps. So while this image is, when this image is first created, it's not decoded. Sorry? Yes, it's encoded. It needs to be decoded before it can be used. And that happens in an asynchronous task that comes in later, right? So if you're going, oh, I'm going to be clever here and get my drag preview to use a base64 image so it's ready straight away, unfortunately that doesn't work, right? Just, it's not decoded, it's not there. External image needs to be downloaded and decoded before it can be used. So if this image didn't exist on your page, it would not work because it would have to it would kick off an asynchronous task to even talk to the network to get it back. And then even when it got it back, it has to decode it. So this won't work, right? You can't have it in there. The way to get around this is to preload your image. So here it's sort of preloaded by the fact that it's in the DOM, but you can easily mess that up. So you might have this image not being cached right, so when the browser does its lookup, it has to hit the network and then it's not going to be there. Or on your testing machine, you might have a wonderful rich data set that has all the icons loaded in on the page somehow. And so all your drag previews are working well. And then your customers don't see those because on their particular data set, they weren't loading in the icon that you actually were going to use in that drag preview. And so it's just not there, right? Not great, not a great situation to be in. So first proposal, I propose that at a minimum, browsers should synchronously decode images they see in drag previews. Like, I think I've had a look around in the Chromium codebase, and I think this is possible, or should be possible. Basically, if it detects an image that is ready but not decoded, just like synchronously decode it, please. This would be great. This would allow you to do something like that. Or if you had an external image that happened to be loaded but not decoded, that would work too. Now, it wouldn't work for external images, but it would unlock that base 64 image case. And this is a proposal, but it's not really changing the web platform. It's just like, can we please just warn engineers that like what is happening? Like it would be very easy to detect that there is an image in this drag preview that's going to get ignored or not rendered correctly. Could you just like put that information in the dev console and tell people how they can fix it? That would be awesome. Like, yeah, hey, your image wasn't able to be used, it wasn't decoded yet. Great. Even if there's nothing else we can do, I think just giving people that information would be so great. Okay, now there are cases where you want to disable the native drag preview. You can use the drag and drop API, you don't have to use the native drag preview. So it is totally fair and valid to use the native drag and drop and use your own drag preview that you move around with CSS transforms. That's what I was doing in that earlier example where I had the frame rate dip, but yeah, so you can definitely do that. In this example, which is not a movie, unfortunately, for some reason. Oh, is it going to work? No. Okay. Anyway, this video is not working right now. I must have posted in the image, not the video. But you can actually do drawing with the drag and drop API. That's totally fine because you just hide the drag preview and you just listen for the dragging events and you just do stuff in response to those, right? Here is resizing. This is actually using the browser's built-in drag and drop capabilities as well. I'm just hiding the native drag preview, listening for those events, and there you go. You can make those changes. How to do this today is pretty whack. There's no way to disable the native drag preview. What you have to do is pass in a tiny transparent GIF as the drag preview. So this is what it looks like for reals in our code today. Now again, I won't go into pragmatic drag and drop specifically, but for those who aren't using this functionality, they don't pay any code for it. It's only people who actually want it. But yeah, so you create a new image where like, you know, this is the inline, you know, the transparent GIF. Now we're doing this when the module loads to preload it, so it's ready for when. So it's pre-encoded for when we use it. So we pass that in, set native drag image. This little tiny transparent GIF. Pretty lame that you have to do that. This one is hard to communicate in slides, but I'm trying. And that is, so here I've got the native drag preview. And when it canceled, you'll see I canceled the drag, and you'll see that the browser slid it back. That's just built in. You know, you don't have to do anything. The browser just does that. Another sweet thing you get for free. Cool. Now, when you've got a transparent GIF or hiding the drag preview, you'll see what happens. You can't really see because you can't see when I release, but I release, and then maybe half a second later, it goes visible again. And you can probably guess why that's happening. It's because it's running that cancel animation, but we just can't see it because the drag preview is invisible, right? So the workaround for this is, if you're using this approach, is to always accept the drop no matter where it happens on the page, so you never actually get a cancel animation. You only get that cancel animation if no element on the page says, I'm happy to accept this drop. So what we do is we just have one on the window that just always accepts the drop if you're doing it this approach. And then you don't get that cancel animation. Now, this would be awesome. Can we please just get this API? I don't want to use transparent GIFs anymore. I think this makes heaps of sense. Just instead of set drag image, like disable drag image, please. Thank you. Restricting drag preview movement. So this is, if you've heard of like locking axis locking. It's where you want to have something draggable, but you only want it to be able to move on one specific plane. This is obviously useful. Like Chrome is even doing this inside of their tab thing. Like they don't want the tab to kind of go vertically, they don't want it to go horizontally. Unfortunately, it is not possible. So yeah, could we have something to control its locking in some way? So say like, hey, I want it to lock on the vertical axis and I only want it to be able to move within some element. Now, I'm not actually super happy with this part because this would mean that you could only have axis locking if you're using a custom drag image, which I don't think is fair. So I think that this should actually be a separate API. But I've made that slide. I think it's copy pasted from a screenshot from code, so I'm definitely not updating that now. All right. Yeah, this is one. After looking in the Chrome code base as well, there doesn't seem to be any technical reason why we can't change the drag preview during a drag, right? So imagine being able to drag something out here. I've changed its background color, but when I move over a specific list, I'm going to change its background color again, the drag preview, and I'm going to add some more text to it. You're going to actually move this from to do to in progress, right? I just made this up, but this is another reason why, probably the biggest reason why people opt out of the web platform is they just don't have the control to be able to do some of these nicer interactions while you're dragging. You want to be able to change this preview to communicate some more information. And right now you just can't, but it looks like that might not be too tricky to change. So what would that mean? It just mean that we could call set drag image again. Like just let us call it again in different drag events throughout the drag, instead of just only in that first drag start event. Cursor control. So unfortunately, the web platform's cursors is like really locked down, which is lame. You can see here it's controlled by a drop effect, which I won't go into, but yeah, there's just not much control there. You can't do this today, which is lame because that's like such a nice cursor. I want to do the cursor grabbing on a little grab hand, but it's just not possible. So yeah, if we could please have the ability either using the pseudo selector or maybe we could have some other API to be able to set this cursor manually in addition to the drop effect. This would be really nice. Okay, how long have we been? A while. That was chapter 1. There's 5 chapters, so we're going to be here till tomorrow. No, they go a lot quicker. That was the meatiest one for sure. So data. Data. This is going to be a big blog when I finally write it. Yeah, so this is the big one. So we've got initial data. We've talked about that, the idea that we have some information associated with the entity. And then also, while we're dragging, we have some data that's changing in response to what's happening. Now, this is how you attach. So the web platform has a data store that you can put data into associated with the drag. Awesome, right? You go, okay, you specify a media type, which is kind of very weird, but you go, okay, I want this to be text plain, and what its value is task 0. Cool. You can also specify your own custom types if you don't want to use the more generic ones. So you can say like, hey, this is a task. X means unregistered. You can also use other fun prefixes like VND or vendor, PRS for personal, or vanity, which kind of sounds fun. But yeah, you can effectively, if you only want that type to just be used by your app, you can just specify some prefix, and that's fine. Unfortunately, the data store has these particular modes. So it has a read-write mode in drag start. So that means that you can put data into the data store and you can read it out again. During the drag, you cannot read that data out. I'll explain why a bit later, but you can't read it out. And this is terrible. Like, this is really, really bad, okay? And then in drop, so that means the drag was successful, you can read out that data again. And this part here is what I want to talk about because it's bad. During the drag, you can only look at the types. So you can say, hey, it's got text / plain, but you can't know what its content is. This is really lame. Like, let's say you have a task, or you wanted to know where it started. You wanted to have much more rich information in here. You can't get it out. So if you look at this, we have And this information is changing as well, right? Like we have the initial data, that's fine. But then what do we do with this data that's like happening and changing during the drag? We can't even write to the data store during the drag to store it. So for the case of the initial data, you can encode, like, you see how I've encoded information in the type, right? Like, and there are actually some constraints here. It has to all be lowercase and like blah, blah. It's just not a great idea, okay? Because you then have to like decode that yourself and like pull the pieces out, and like this is bad. And also you can only do that. This is only solves the case for that initial data, right? But it doesn't help you with the runtime data. So the option 2 is just use a side channel, which is a really fancy way of saying a local variable. A local variable in your own code, you can just dump whatever data you want in there when the drag's starting, and you can put whatever data you want anywhere during the drag, okay? This is what pragmatic drag and drop does. It has its own local variable that it stores the initial data in, and it's also keeping track of the runtime data. Like, yeah, it's really, really easy to work around, but it's lame that you just can't use the web platform to do this. Why do they do this? Something to keep in mind is that drag and drop was a fairly early feature, or early-ish feature. So the idea is security. So the logic is that if you're starting in page A and you drag over a malicious page into page B, you don't want this in the middle page to get access to that data, right? Which kind of makes sense. If you were storing some sensitive information in there, you don't want other pages to get it. This is now like a solved problem. So local storage has a security model where it's called the same origin policy. So you have to have it on the same protocol, host, and port, and then you can access that in multiple places. So like to solve this problem, they could just use the same origin policy, right? This would not be on the same origin, can't get access to the data, happy days. This is on the same origin, this is on the same origin, you can access the data, happy days, right? So yeah, so that's the proposal there. Like maybe not even, we kind of need write mode to be able to have that live data. But I think this one kind of warrants a bit further discussion, whether it's read-only or read-write. But effectively, I think if security is the reason why we cannot get access to this data, for same origin, that argument doesn't apply. So I think we should revisit that. And then this would be you could keep it what it is today if it's not on the same origin. Alternatively, even if you're not using the same origin, you could just have like a local only security model. So same idea as before, except only the page that started the drag would be able to read and write during the drag. Right. That would be great too. That would be great. That would be great. We could also add some extra things into the drag to like so you as an engineer could find out a little bit more about what the behavior is at any given time and like what's happening. Cool, so that's data. Events. So if you want to know when a drag's finished, you have these two events. You have the drop event, which fires on the drop target, which is the element that most recently cancelled the drag over and drag enter events. I won't go into all that. And we have drag end, which this fires on the original draggable element. I'm going to focus on drag end. So this is a slide that I took from somewhere. I'm going to start racing now because I can see the time. But this is a virtual list. So what that means is that instead of rendering all the items in the list all the time, we only render the visible ones. This is a really powerful performance technique for super large data sets. Now, unfortunately, what that means is that your original draggable element might be unmounted during the drag. And if that was what you were using, if that draggable's gone, you don't get the drag end event anymore. So if the drop was not successful, which might not happen, then you don't get a drag end. You get no signal that the drag finished at all. Like you just don't know. You never hear about it. So what do? You have to listen for other events like pointer move and pointer down. These events shouldn't happen during a drag. And if you see these events, then you know the drag has finished. It is pretty balked. This is what it kind of looks like in pragmatic drag and drop. unfortunately, Firefox actually lets a few through in the first a little bit of time, so you have to kind of allow some buffer for it. But anyway, that's kind of the idea. So proposing we add a new drag event called drag completed, which doesn't fire on the draggable element, because that can be unmounted validly during a drag. Can we please fire a new event called drag completed on the document? Right? So we always know when a drag's finished. We don't have to worry about this element always having to be there to know if the drag finishes. Speaking about external entities, so this is when you're dragging a file or something into a browser. How do we know? You get a drag enter event where the related target is null. It's pretty funny, but that's true. And if you're leaving, you get the related target is null. So this is where it's going to. It's going to nowhere, so it's leaving the document. Unfortunately for Safari, it always sets related target as null. And so I kid you not, that is the code over there in that tiny font. There's a lot of comments, but effectively it's counting drag enter and drag leave events to figure out when they're leaving the browser, which is lame. So please, let's just fix Safari. That'd be great. Yeah, I propose instead of listening, this is a little proposal. It's not the end of the world, but instead of relying on related target being null, it's pretty kind of a whack thing, to have to look for to know if you're leaving the window. Can't we just have another event, please? External drag start, external drag end, and our new external drag complete. Rather than even looking, we don't even have to look at related target anymore. We can just use a new event. I think we could just have another event. That'd be great. And you could also publish this information on it, so you can know. This is actually really useful to know. Is the drag starting from me or is it starting from somewhere else? Right now, you kind of have to do a lot of. You have to know that. It'd be nice to just look at the drag event and be able to tell that. Whew, almost there. Automatic scrolling. The browser has built-in automatic scrolling. Oh, sorry. So firstly, this is a board. It's got a horizontal scroll. So this is what you see in Trello. It's got a horizontal scroll and vertical scrolling on the lists. Yep. Now, this is me dragging and then scrolling with my mouse wheel. So I've started a drag, and then I'm using my other finger and I'm moving the mouse wheel. This is actually what it looks like. It's a bit octopusy, but it can be done. Now the platform has automatic scrolling. So what that means is that when you get close to an edge, it will automatically scroll. Unfortunately, the browser's one is cooked. It's really hard to trigger. You get about 2 pixels, 3 pixels of space that you can trigger it. It only triggers a set speed. It's not very easy or ergonomic to use. And this is consistent across the browsers. This isn't defined in the spec. For whatever reason, it's just defined in this same really bad way. I'm guessing there were some constraints at the time, but it's pretty bad. So this is an auto scroller that as an optional auto scroller, we built for pragmatic drag and drop. And you can see it's a lot better. It's based on the one from React Beautiful D&D. It's even better than that one, actually. But it uses things like time dampening, distance dampening. You can enable and disable on certain axes. It's got overflow scrolling, so what that means is you can pull outside of a container and it can still scroll. It's a lot nicer to work with. It feels a lot nicer too. Unfortunately, you can't disable the browser's built-in drag and drop auto scroller. So what that means is you can get into scenarios where our auto scroller is happening and then you trigger the browser's one and you end up with this lightning fast scroll speed. It is pretty hard to trigger because their one is pretty hard to trigger, but it is possible because you can't disable their one. So yeah, it'd be nice if we could just disable their auto scrolling. Say no thanks, your one's bad, I got a better one. Can you just turn yours off, please? It would also be nice if they just made it better by default. That'd be great. They could steal some of the stuff we've done, or have the ability to, give us heaps of control over the auto scrolling. This is, I don't know if this is up to date, but this is sort of the configuration we have for our auto scroller. You can configure lots of different attributes about how the automatic scrolling happens. Lastly, bugs. This is just the only slide of it, but just so people know, there's just so many bugs. I just really want this isn't really a proposal. I'm just please. fix these bugs. So Chrome, active and hover styles can be triggered during a drag. Firefox, drag events in Firefox don't get correct client X and Y values. Mouse enter and mouse leave events can fire while dragging, should be blocked. Chrome, when a drag is finished, mouse enter can occur on an incorrect element. The workaround for this kind of broke me. Chrome, when clearing data for the draggable store, it incorrectly moves files when it shouldn't. When starting a drag, a cursor can flash with a copy icon in Chrome. I actually fixed this in Chrome, but my fix got conflicted and now doesn't work. Chrome, when dropping on no drop targets, drag and drag leave events happen with incorrect client X values. Data transfer items can be accessed outside of drag, start, and drag, and I'm going to stop there. But there's a lot. I probably went too far through that. There's a lot. And I just, please. The amount of stuff we've had to do to get, just to use a platform feature is outrageous. It's outrageous. And it shouldn't have to be that hard. So if we could please fix those bugs, that would be really nice. I do plan on putting these in a blog. That plan is pretty loose because I know how big this blog is going to be, but I do plan on doing that. Thank you for bearing with me. I know that was a lot, but yeah, appreciate it.